All right, here is a quick little video on ecological footprints. Um, and for those of you who have subscribed to the channel and in my class, we are kind of going out of order. If you notice the number on this is like 5.11 or something like that. I tried to rearrange the topics so that they made a little more sense to me. So, what is an ecological footprint? Well, you probably heard about a carbon footprint before, which is kind of how much carbon dioxide you or a government or a company is responsible for putting into the air. Well, you can go bigger than that and you can look at something called an ecological footprint, which is a measure of, let's say, for an individual person, how much that person consumes, how many resources, how much land is required to support that individual person's lifestyle. You can also look at the ecological footprint of a country, of a state, and just kind of think about how much land or how many resources are required to produce everything that supports those people. Now, the more resources you use, the more resource intensive the stuff you have is to make, the larger your ecological footprint. And it also involves the what's required to kind of offset the waste that you produce as well, or get rid of the waste. So a carbon footprint would be part of an ecological footprint. And this tends to be different, much larger for developed nations and individuals in developed nations than for individuals in developing countries or even for developing countries themselves. So here are the various things that make up the ecological footprint. Like I said, a carbon footprint is a part of it. Also looks at the land. So for example, this is apartments in a city, and then how much forest land there is, cropland and pasture, as well as fisheries. There's also livestock, all of these things. And it measures basically how fast we use up resources and make waste compared to how fast nature can absorb that waste and generate new resources. So it measures our consumption and it measures how much the planet can kind of restore from our consumption. So let's look at those two factors. Consumption is how much a population is a measure of how much a population is using as far as resources go, and how much of resources are necessary to absorb waste. So if you think about one thing, think about food waste or our trash. That needs to be decomposed. It needs to be recycled. If it's in a landfill, natural processes are going to have to take care of that and break it down into something that, you know, resources some other organism can use. And so all of those natural processes, which are part of the ecosystem services that we get out of nature, are going to be part of this consumption part of the ecological footprint. Note that we are especially thinking about carbon emissions as well, just because climate change is a really big deal. It's going to be kind of the key issue of your lifetime. This includes all the things that we use. So, plant based food, any fibers. And if you're thinking, I don't use fibers, it's not like I use rope. This is the stuff we use to make cloth. So, cotton, any of those things, hemp rope, for example. Then there's livestock and fish products, timber and other forest products, and all the space we need to build our cities and our suburbs. And even farther from that, we have something we'll talk about later called exurbs. So it's going to track how we use the kind of productive areas of the planet. Then there is the kind of supply that nature supplies. So this is something called biocapacity, and it's related to the productivity of the land. So how much cropland are we using? And on that cropland, how much corn, for example, can it produce? Grazing land, how many acres of land or hectares of land do we need to support enough cattle to feed, 5 people a year? How much forest land is needed to produce the wood products that are used by a certain society, how much fish do you need to catch in order to support a society. Another thing is you can keep in mind that areas that have not really been modified by humans can absorb some of the waste that we generate, especially carbon emissions. Like I said, that's going to be a big issue we're going to talk about with Unit 9, which are the emissions from burning fossil fuel. So just a couple of interesting graphs that I found on this website, which is right here, footprintnetwork.org. they have a lot of interesting data. So here what we're looking at is a diagram showing the total ecological footprint per country. And I believe this is from like 2018, and it's measured in like hectares of land that are required to support. So the darker brown you are, the more resources your country is using. So if you'll notice, the countries that are kind of using the most resources are the US, China, and India. Notice that this is the use per country, not per person in country. That's something we're going to look at. So if you think about it, the US has a huge impact. I think the last time I checked, we were at about 330 million people. On the other hand, China has like, I think 1.4 billion people. India, I think, was at about 1.2 billion. Um, and these numbers may not be completely up to date, but they give you kind of a relative idea. India has 4 times the population as the United States, yet it still has a similar like ecological impact as the United States. So each person in the US has 4 times the impact of an individual person in India on the planet in terms of resources we use. This is what I meant by the fact that developing countries tend to use less resources than developed countries per person. But if you'll note, the two most populous countries on the planet have a huge impact just because each individual may use less resources, but there's a lot of them. So that magnifies the amount of resources they use. In contrast, if you look at the per capita or per person ecological footprint, you'll notice some similarities. For example, the US is on here. That it makes sense. We use a lot of resources, but then Canada does as well. You have a few European and Eastern European countries. You have some countries in the Middle East. For those of you who've been watching the World Cup, that's Qatar right there. You have Mongolia actually using a lot of resources compared to how much they can produce. And if you're like, wait, what are Mongolians doing? Think about the fact that a lot of their land is desert and may not be as productive. So the amount of resources needed to support each person in Mongolia may not be producible by the land in Mongolia. Australia, also a lot of desert, also has a higher ecological footprint per person. And so you'll notice some differences here, some things that you can think about. Well, if you live in a place like Australia that's very desert, or a place like Qatar, which is desert, the people who live there will either have to import resources from other parts of the world if their land is not capable of producing enough resources to support the population, or they might have to decrease resource use. Another thing to think about, the United States, we have a lot of land, got a decent amount of people. We use a lot more resources per person and in total than a lot of the rest of the world. So that might be a time to start thinking about our individual impact on our ecological footprint and what kinds of things we can change as a society to make sure we're not using as many resources. And sorry for the noise, my cat decided that the sound of my voice means it's time to play. And one thing that I found really interesting on this website is there was this nice graph that was showing um, when it shows the biocapacity of the planet per person, which is how much like land it takes to support an individual person, versus the ecological footprint per person, which is how much land is required to support the resources an individual actually uses. You'll notice that up until about 1970, it looks like the biocapacity per person was higher than each person's ecological footprint, meaning that the planet was able to sustain those people. But now you'll notice that the ecological footprint went higher and it's kind of almost constant, but the biocapacity of the planet is decreasing. And if you're like, wait, why should it decrease? It's not like we have less land. When you have degraded resources, a lot of forest land has been cut down, a lot of wetlands have been cleared for cities and things like that. We've actually been reducing the capacity of the planet to kind of offset our resource use. So that is also another thing that needs to be taken into account, not only using less resources, but helping to restore the natural systems that are providing all these ecosystem services that help kind of offset our resource use. All right, so sorry for the view of my Bitmoji shoes, but I figured that fit with footprint. Um, the next videos won't probably load until after Christmas, so enjoy your break from me, guys.